Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank all of our witnesses for being with us today and sharing your insights. This subcommittee held a Alzheimer's disease hearing last year, and the world is obviously quite different today than it was then. We're in the midst of a global pandemic that has upended everything. But in the midst of all of this, I must say that I've been amazed by the innovation that has emerged in the past 9 months, from new diagnostic tools and therapies to a vaccine that was approved last week. So, if we as a nation can innovate at such a rapid speed to defeat COVID-19, I think we can also put that energy into defeating Alzheimer's. Uh, and we have to ensure, however, that every American benefits from medical innovation. Even the most revolutionary new medicines are ultimately worthless if they do not reach the people that need them. So I believe we have to commit to ensuring that every American benefits from advancements in Alzheimer's diagnosis and treatment. And part of that includes improving clinical trial diversity. So let me ask Dr. Carrillo and Dr. Mohs. I have been working to engage pharmaceutical companies and other research to improve diversity in clinical trials. In your written testimony, you highlighted the need for increased participation by minority communities in Alzheimer's disease trials. How are your organizations working to address this urgent need, and what role can the federal government play to address this need?
Well, I can start, and thank you, Senator, for that question. And it's nice to hear my name pronounced correctly, actually. Thank you very much for that. It is such an important thing to study underrepresented populations. I'll just speak for Latinos in particular. It's important that all my colleagues here, I think, recognize that not all Hispanic and Latin Americans can actually be painted with the same brush. We are all very different. And even recently, Dr. Hector Gonzalez at the University of California published some work from the Sol Inca study, of course funded by NIH, highlighting that even the most well-studied to date risk factor gene, ApoE4, does not confer the same risk on all the populations, depending, of course, upon their background. This is important, and so we need to really think about how we're going to invest in research that really highlights the importance of understanding diverse populations, especially if we're going to apply those to any kind of therapeutic or early detection diagnostic. So that's an important point. And we at the Alzheimer's Association are actually working very closely with the NIH on something that they've published recently and are currently revising, called Alzheimer's Disease and Related Dementias Clinical Studies Recruitment Planning Guide and National Strategy for Recruitment and Participation. Now, my organization in particular is working, of course, with the federal government, but we also have decided to put our money where our mouth is. And all clinical trials that we fund now require, if you want our money, to ensure that you have diverse populations represented in those study populations you are recruiting. And that is an important point. On top of that, the US Pointer study is shooting for 30% recruitment. And the New Ideas platform, which is going to study 7,000 people with an amyloid PET scan, is requiring 2,000 Black Americans and 2,000 African Americans of those 7,000. So that's a majority. So that's what we're trying to do in order to ensure that when we do find those diagnostics and those treatments, they are actually for everyone. Thank you for the question and for your efforts.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is Dr. Mohs. Thank you for the question, and it's a pleasure to follow Dr. Carrillo and trying to address this. We haven't been nearly as good as we should be in getting members of minority groups to participate in clinical trials, and as a result, the conclusions that can be drawn from those trials are still uncertain as to whether or not they apply to all segments of the population. So we need to fix this problem. The organization that I currently work with has taken two approaches. One is to try to bring members of the minority community, African Americans and Latinos, to clinical trial sites. And we've done a lot of things to try to do that, bringing in speakers that would resonate with members of minority groups, et cetera. And to some extent that has worked. It helps with engagement, but it hasn't always translated into enrollment in clinical trials. Because interest doesn't necessarily lead people to want to volunteer. And there may be many reasons for that. A second approach is to try to take the research centers and the research activities to the communities where African Americans and Hispanic patients reside. And I think ultimately that is likely to be more successful. Unfortunately, right now, most of the clinical research centers are not located in the communities where those patients reside. So we've tried to take some steps to encourage health systems that serve primarily African American or Hispanic patients to become involved in research, and that may produce more salutary results. I do think that there is some value, as I mentioned in the written testimony, to asking FDA to provide clear guidance to sponsors on what they expect to see in terms of ethnic diversity in clinical trials, because most commercial sponsors will respond to guidance from regulatory authorities. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, may I have one final question?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. With Latinos 1.5 more times likely to develop Alzheimer's than their white counterparts, in your testimony, Dr. Mohs, you mentioned that we are not diagnosing enough people in the early stages of Alzheimer's when they might still be candidates for a trial. In lower income communities, there remain many barriers to assessing an appropriate diagnosis of Alzheimer's, let alone an early one. What can be done to improve access for patients in underserved communities to ensure they're able to access resources and information and be eligible for these clinical trials?
Yes, thank you. As I also mentioned in the written testimony, and as was discussed by some of the other participants, we are making substantial progress in what I hope will be low cost, potentially widely available blood-based and digital biomarkers that will assist in the early diagnosis and may make it possible to make very clear diagnoses without the time-consuming and expensive and highly specialized resources that are now required to make diagnoses earlier. Those technologies, the blood-based simple ones, which could be very inexpensive, are advancing. I think we need additional support to do further clinical research to understand exactly how good they are and how they should be applied in conjunction with other things in clinical practice. And there needs to be some incentives, financial incentives through insurance and healthcare reimbursement systems to make sure that clinicians are reimbursed for using those tests.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.